Hi, Bob. Thank you for joining me here today. In order to introduce you, I thought we'd start off with your career. You hold the chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health. Can you tell us what exactly this entails, as well as what has inspired you to pursue sustainable water management?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Camille. And in answer to your question, that I have three goals in my working with the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health, which is the only UN university that happens to be in this country and it happens to be on water. So my goals include dispelling the myth of unlimited abundance of water here and globally, and also building a bridge between scientific research outcomes and finding language in that bridge that policymakers can use to craft timely and durable public policy. And finally, to bring international example to bear on the growing number of water and water-related climate problems that we face here and abroad. And my career really started with an accident on a glacier when I was a young man, which led to me being very interested in ice. And of course, being interested in ice means you're interested in what happens to it as water. And I think that throughout my whole life, I've really worked hard to prevent my culture from taking me downstream and away from the luminous glory of that glacial light. So I've never been far from water, and working on matters related to upland regions, one does concern themselves with water. And then I was very much taken by the link between water and climate, and that has defined my life for the last 25 years.
Very nice. So you mentioned that we sort of live in this paradigm right now of limitless water, but that might not actually be the case. What are some major water-related issues that we're facing right now?
Well, I think there's quite a number of major water-related issues, but they're not. It's interesting because when you get involved in water and water-related climate matters, you begin to find out it's not always water that's actually the obstacle. And some of our major water-related issues include growing divisiveness in our democracies, libertarian governments rolling back 50 years of progress in water regulations, the failure to understand the role of regulation, not as a limitation to development, but as a protection for all. And we're seeing this slide backwards widely. And also the failure to see the relationship between global change, climate change, and the global water cycle. The power of paid deniers to confuse the public in terms of the real threat that climate change poses, particularly to water security. Deeply and widely held expert entrenchments and outmoded ideas and practices. Sometimes you see this in our hard engineering approaches to what can be solved with soft engineering solutions. And we see this too, certainly in the extent of groundwater overdraft that's occurring globally. Another threat that we face is the growing presence of contaminants of emerging concern with which we don't know how to deal. Also, we have globally, and even in developed countries, huge deficits in the operation, maintenance, and replacement of vital water infrastructure. We're not keeping it up, and much of it's already at or beyond its natural engineered lifespan. The devastating impacts of climate change that are already having on infrastructure is a threat, and we see that with major floods and extreme weather events. And the global failure to achieve the UN's Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Goals, particularly related to the Goal 6 pertaining to water. I also see as an obstacle here and a major water-related barrier is a largely unaware, self-entitled population in the developed world that fails in its civic duties and fails to see just how close we potentially are to really serious problems, perhaps even collapse in some parts of the world. And this will be triggered in part by crisis of availability of adequate, reliable supplies of water. And if we want to see what insecurity will look like in the future and how it will affect stability of societies and also the potential for future conflict, just look at water security.
Some very, very pressing issues. Now, I wanted to ask you how water security issues have evolved over the course of your career, but you mentioned sliding backwards. Do you think that some of the big emerging trends are more related to trends in governance of water more than the issues themselves?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the biggest problems with water are not that we don't know how to manage them. The biggest problems are governance. Let me point out that this is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And let's go back to 1970. And this kind of closes the circle for me, in that I participated in that first Earth Day. And I have to say that that was a very heady time. And it was interesting now, this year, to track our progress nationally and globally over the last 50 years. And there was real action in the first 20 years, and maybe even say 30 years. Globally, there was talk about meaningful action to stave off the linked threats to the stability of the Earth system posed by diminishment of global biodiversity and climate change. The UN created global conventions to combat deforestation, desertification, and biodiversity loss. And the UN created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And though the link between biodiversity decline and climate stability had not yet been fully recognized, it looked like the world was heading in the right direction. And then things suddenly changed big time. And I think it's really important to note that there was an undeclared war between corporations, and particularly those in the fossil fuel sector, and environmental idealism. And this war broke out widely and was more or less held clandestinely and through agents that were hired to undermine these policies. But it wasn't just corporations involved in this. There was a subtle but ultimately fundamental shift in the mandate of many environmental ministries, not just here, but around the world. Whereas in the 1970s, environmental ministries were committed to environmental protection. By the 1990s, the focus had become environmental assurance instead. And that meant that instead of protecting the environment for its own sake, it was now the role of environmental ministries to find appropriate ways to mitigate the impacts of approved resource extraction and other developments. In other words, government gave the environment to the free market to take care of largely. And 50 years after the first Earth Day, we can see where all that slick political sleight of hand and public relations spin has led us, where what were once local environmental problems like oil spills in 1970 became regional problems. And what were regional problems like habitat loss and surface and groundwater contamination and eutrophication are now national problems. And what were then national problems, such as biodiversity loss, air and water pollution, have grown prospectively to become a serious threat to the fundamental biodiversity-based planetary life support function, of which the climate threat is only one of many alarming expressions.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting perspective on the historical time lapse of it, I guess. How does climate change impact water security, and what will it mean for achieving sustainable water practices in the future?
Well, let me review briefly for you our updated understanding of climate change effects, particularly on water. And all of these effects, as James Hansen has famously said, are related in some way or another to water. And land use and cover change are only the beginning of the effect human activities are having on the global hydrologic cycle. Our entire earthly reality is defined by all the ways in which water reacts with nearly every element in the physical world. So if you change a few parameters that pertain to water, and the world you see out your window becomes different. Mm-hmm. And some parameters, however, have more influence than others over the nature and function of any given hydroclimatic circumstance. The changing of a single defining parameter, temperature, for example, changes all the other biogeochemical parameters. So if our global temperature changes, an entire new geometry is created around that change. And that's what we call the loss of hydrologic stationarity. And the most frightening discovery of this young century is that that is exactly what's happening. The rate and manner in which water moves through the global hydrologic cycle is accelerating, and it's happening right before our eyes, everywhere. And the most profound changes to the hydrologic cycle relate to how much more water a warmer atmosphere can hold. So if you increase the temperature of the atmosphere by 2 degrees, the atmosphere can carry as much as 14% more water vapor, because for every degree Celsius of warming, it can carry 7% more. So if you raise the temperature of the atmosphere by 4 degrees, it can carry 28% more water vapor, which changes everything. More water vapor in the atmosphere is making storms more powerful, heat waves more intense, and drought deeper and more persistent. And that's why newly discovered phenomena such as atmospheric rivers demand our full attention. These rivers are these enormous water vapor channels aloft that can be thousands of kilometers long, and they can carry enormous volumes of water. And when they hit land, they cause flooding of magnitudes that we've never witnessed before. And we've found that the power of these extraordinary water extremes is tied to the temperature gradient between the mid-latitudes and the poles. And that's a gradient that is being diminished by the warming of the global atmosphere. And this also affects the jet stream. And put simply, the northern hemisphere jet stream, or what's often called the polar jet stream here, are westerly winds that are created as the world spins inside the torn blanket of its own atmosphere. And the behavior of the jet stream is also tied to the temperature gradient between the mid-latitudes and the poles, a gradient that's breaking down. So if you've ever watched the news, and I'm sure everyone who watched this will see this, that the jet stream curves around in these great meanders. And the first sign that something important was changing was that the increase we have seen in witnessing in the last years in the waviness of the jet stream. And it brings, because it's getting wavier and going deeper, it's bringing cold Arctic air to ever lower latitudes than in the past. And when people say to me, well, how can there be climate change when our winters are so cold? And here's what's happening. In addition to being larger in amplitude, meanders move eastward more slowly, causing weather patterns to move more slowly. And it's these persistent weather patterns that result in the intensification we're witnessing of events in which duration is an important factor, like droughts, flooding, heat waves, and cold spells. So we see from the altered behavior of the jet stream that warmer atmospheric temperatures do not automatically translate into warmer weather, and a uniformly warmer and therefore more turbulent atmosphere, both warm and cold fronts end up and persist in places in the mid-latitudes in which they were not common in the past. And they often oscillate with extraordinarily damaging effects. So alarmingly, on top of this, the overall combination of ice loss and the loss of snow in the northern hemisphere may contribute to an additional 50% of global heating effect caused by the addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So in tandem, these combined effects are going to have a profound impact on water security globally. And we can't predict in many ways what that will mean.
With high consequences that we're already seeing. So you perform the critical role of translating scientific research for policymakers. What are some of the biggest challenges and rewards associated with this task? Do you think that science is making its way into policy quick enough to address these changes?
Well, clearly not, or it wouldn't be in this much trouble. But I think the biggest challenge that we face is being heard and then being believed against the caterwaul of distraction, trivia, drivel, and gossip that largely characterizes what we're subject to and much of what we communicate to one another in this highly fractious period in human history. And for this caterwaul, I don't just hold social media responsible, but news networks and the press who with a few very notable exceptions, I should say, I feel has been irresponsible to the point of moral failure in dealing with some of these crises. But the biggest rewards, in answer to your question, are working with some of the finest minds in the world and with some of the world's best scientists, and especially, I should say, working with youth. I was involved in a number of international youth conferences before COVID, and I've been involved with youth webinars since, and I am enormously impressed. Many young people may not be greatly experienced, but one of the things that I admire greatly of them is they're clear-eyed. And I work with a number of youth who have amazed me by the fact of how articulate, knowledgeable, persistent, compassionate, and above all, how courageous they have been and are. And it is in youth that my hope for the future presently resides.
So you mentioned the issue of feeling heard in public discourse and social media and things like that. Some might argue that the idea of sustainability is becoming increasingly trendy among the public. Do you think that public awareness of these issues exerts additional pressure on decision makers and makes sound practices easier to achieve?
Well, I think I agree that we have learned more about the Earth system in the last 30 years than we have in the entire rest of the history of humanity. And unfortunately, we've collected a great deal of data we haven't interpreted and assimilated into common knowledge. And in my mind, a huge gap exists between science and its incorporation into evidence-based public policy. And I'm clearly of the view that you don't want and can't expect scientists to both conduct research and make linkages to public policy. Different kinds of thinking are required here. So I think a whole new discipline is needed here. And that discipline will include the coming generation creating a discipline in which we're able to translate these complicated scientific ideas and also the complexity of the scientific method and its persistent and eternal search for truth into language that other kinds of decision makers can use.
So to build on that, do you think that you're talking about the transformation of science into policy and translating the research into a medium that policymakers can use to create the policy? Do you think that better policy always translates into better practices, or if not, what are some of the challenges there?
I think sometimes it does, but certainly not enough and not fast enough. One of the things that I found in my work is that it's not always what you do or try to do that seems to affect policy most often. Not that you will always know whether it has or not, but it's instead of what we do or say, it's often what we prevent that we work in policy now. And we're trying to keep the world from sliding backwards, and we're not yet at a point where we hold enough sway and that people are informed enough and believe enough in the scientific evidence to make those kinds of policies and to direct the world in that way. If that were so, we wouldn't be in the trouble that we're in. And I think the problem here, and we've looked at this very carefully, and you know this as a scientist, science is built on rationality. It's built on the scientific method, which is very rigorous. And politics is not rational, it's visceral and emotional. So we need, as I said, a whole generation of people who can translate the rational into language that irrational and sometimes highly emotional and sometimes very self-centered people will react to. And I often think that while it's really important to continue to build on our science, that it's probably more important to build that bridge between the outcomes and how people think about their lives in the future.
So are there certain industries or practices that disproportionately are responsible for water-related risks? And how would they need to change in order to be more sustainable?
Well, let me talk first about sustainability here. You're talking really about whether, I think sustainability has been really trendy for a long time. But for the longest time, it had no sound foundation, no sound basis in common definition. And if you look what happened in this part of the world, sustainability came to be just, it was a catchword. It meant anything to anyone, anything they wanted. I mean, I just remember sustainable oil sands operations. I mean, really, mining is not sustainable. It never was meant to be. And I also found that there was a period there that everybody was into. It was so trendy. You had to have sustainable in your mission plan, no matter what business you were in. And it was rather like everybody marching hand in hand down the street singing Kumbaya. And everything went fine until somebody asked where we were all going. And we weren't going to the same place.
Right.
And I think that one thing that's really critically important about the Sustainable Development Goals, the Transforming Our World's Global Sustainable Development Agenda, is that it fixed that. It really defined what all elements of sustainability need to do. And I think it's one of the greatest public policy achievements in human history, but it's not being implemented. And I think we should take a little bit of a responsibility for that, because I think it was a mistake to represent the SDGs in the form of a periodic table. Because what's happened since is that people pick the ones that they like, the ones that they're engaged in, and they say that they're achieving the Sustainable Development Goals when they all link with one another. And now we see what sustainability really demands, and it shows that real sustainability cannot be achieved without wholesale societal reform. But again, science has helped us here. One of the greatest and most helpful scientific breakthroughs of this young century is that the Earth system is self-regulating in terms of balancing incoming heat of the sun with the optimal life conditions on Earth. And it's been found that the heating of the sun has been slow enough to allow life on Earth. And even though the sun output has increased by 20%, the temperature of the Earth didn't rise by anything would be appropriate with that. So life managed to ensure the planet's surface temperature is very little from its current temperature. So what we learned from this, and this is the foundation for a new way of thinking about sustainability, is we don't have to sit back and accept the loss of the world we know. One of the most important things we know about the slowing and moderating of climate heating effects, and therefore affecting climate water security, is that intact systems absorb climate impacts and preserve hydrologic regimes. Intact systems do that everywhere. And even where I live, researchers have shown that intact systems have already absorbed 4 degrees of warming without significant changes in hydrologic regimes. So what this tells us is that at the moment, at least, what we saved in terms of natural processes is saving us. And it's therefore critical to protect what we have for the sake of the integrity and resilience of the larger Earth system. So you might ask, well, where do we go from here? Well, I think we need a broader perspective, and we need to ask one another broader questions. Like we asked one another where we were when the Berlin Wall fell or when 9/11 happened. Why don't we ask one another where we were when the CO2 concentration of the Earth's atmosphere reached 400 parts per million, or when the Larsen B ice shelf collapsed? So I think the first thing we need to realize that if we're going to have any hope of addressing the climate threat in time and stabilizing the hydrologic cycle, we need reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation, first with one another and with the Earth. And we now know what Indigenous people have known for thousands of years. We can reduce and moderate the threat of climate disruption by protecting, restoring, and constantly rehabilitating natural system function. So it's not the end of the world by any means. It's just the beginning of another. And there's great power in realizing that. For it's at the local level, the community level in which people live, that we have the most power to affect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. And so to that end, the UN's calling for a restoration imperative as part of the SDGs. And it goes beyond environment. It would demand that we first restore local identity and humanity's sense of place and connection. It demands we restore truth, responsibility to human dignity, economic morality and equality, and in so doing, restore common purpose and a common vision for the future of humanity and the planet. And most urgently, such an imperative must be an immediately effective vehicle for not just the protection, but the rapid restoration of critical natural ecosystem function, so that we can step back and restore balance in the world and step back from the climate crisis. So in my view, what we urgently need now is a new and very different enlightenment. But no enlightenment can proceed without a renaissance. And we need all of us to be part of that renaissance, part of that new and wiser beginning. And the heart of that should be, a renaissance should be a revival of respect for one another and a profound sense of place. And also we should not permit ourselves to be divided over critical earth matters like the climate threat. And I'd like to see that renaissance start now.
What a great perspective. It's not about hoping that things won't change. It's about having agency and making sure that they change for the better.
Well, I think that I'd just like to speak to what your comment was, because too often those who want to see a better world are seen as being opposed to something, this development or that development. What we want to be seen as being for something, and what we want to be seen for is for our desire to create a better world. It's not against everything. We're trying to argue on behalf of and for the world we want.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what are your thoughts on the interconnection in between sustainable water management and truth and reconciliation? How can traditional ecological knowledge be incorporated into current water management practices, and what can we learn from First Nations with regards to water ethics?
Well, what I've discovered in this country and abroad, even in some of the most contested, conflicted places in the world, well, you can't get people to agree on anything else. You can get them to agree on water. And I've had a lot of cases where this. I'll tell you a local story that I find quite amusing. We had a local MP, his name was Myron Thompson. He was famous in our country for being extremely right-wing and very opposed to climate change. And I needed to see the Minister of Environment for the country, and I had to go through my MP to do that. And the mayor here in town organized a lunch, but he warned me, he said, this MP is not, he doesn't believe in climate change, and you're gonna have a tough time getting him to do anything for you, even to talk to you. So I was ready for him. And when I walked into the restaurant, I was still 4 meters away when he said, none of my constituents want that whole climate thing. I don't know why you're here to talk to me. And I said, well, you may not agree on climate, but how are you on water? Well, he got all flustered and turned red, and he said, well, my dad was the water master in Colorado. Sit down, we can talk about water. And we became notoriously good friends. Nobody could understand how we could even be in the same room together.
Amazing.
The commonality was water. And we also learned something really important about reconciliation in the Northwest Territories. I helped advise very, very astute leaders there on the development of a water strategy that turned into a transboundary agreement with their upstream neighbors on the management of the Mackenzie system. And while they're all truly individual people in the North, they agreed that water was the most important thing that they could, they wanted to assure that is central to their identity and to their future. So what we find in this and many other countries is unresolved and uncharacterized Indigenous water rights are a very serious issue. And in this country, for example, it's stalling economic progress all over the country because First Nations will not permit certain things to happen that will impact their water resources and their traditional way of life. So we have devised mechanisms similar to what was used, the collaborative leadership scenario planning processes that were used to end the apartheid period in South Africa. That's how serious some of the water issues are. We're going to that diplomatic length to resolve some of these. And what we realize is that we need to create a post-colonial Canada and ensure that we have truly meaningful reconciliation if we're going to have the kind of future you want to live in the future. And we have started that dialogue with water. And
amazing.
That's what's got us together.
Fantastic. Steps are being taken. I also wanted to ask you how COVID-19 has impacted UN proceedings. What challenges might we be facing into the future due to the pandemic, and how are world leaders attempting to mitigate these obstacles?
It's important to recognize that the pandemic has put a society on hold. I call it the Great Pause. And it's really important in the Great Pause not just to focus on the difficulties we all individually face and looking to what kind of future might we have. We've got to really think about the kind of future we want. And we must use this extraordinary hiatus to thoughtfully consider how we can perpetuate our gains in carbon emissions reductions, while at the same time making other critically needed changes to our economies and lifestyle expectations that will make us not just less vulnerable to pandemics in the future, but that will bolster meaningful, persistent action in achieving the goals of the UN's 2030 Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Agenda. And in my view, there's great urgency here. We need to change the direction we are going in time to ensure we never come this close again to crossing the threshold of societal collapse. And we need to use this time and think very thoughtfully about where we're going to go as a result of this. And we cannot allow the pandemic to stall progress toward those goals.
So you are the author, co-author, or editor of more than 30 books, and you have earned several awards for science writing. Can you tell us a little bit about your most recent book, Quenching the Dragon?
There's actually been a couple since, but that one's quite interesting. Because,
author. I missed them.
That's all right. One of the things that first of all, I was surprised that I actually cumulatively had spent a fair amount of time in China. I didn't really think that way because China is such a large country and has such extraordinary long history and culture, and also some of the world's most extraordinary environmental problems. And China's problems with water are the world's future problems. And also, because of climate and the relationship to water and climate, they're going to probably be the bellwether of one of the most important developments that will happen as a result of further climate heating. And that's intra and inter-country involuntary human migration. And China has several serious problems with respect to it, and both of them relate to water. The interior areas are drying dramatically and desertification is advancing. And in the coastal regions, sea level rise is really beginning to affect some of the most populated centers of all of Asia. So what they fear there is being in the pincer of the impacts of first of all, the decline in natural systems in their own country, and then the impacts of warming on not just the environmental elements, but also on human livelihoods. What you don't have is have those people fleeing the dry interior, confronting those people from the coast heading inland to get away from sea level rise. So there's a great deal that we need to know about them. And from a Canadian point of view, and I wrote much about the similarities of water problems between Canada and China in this book, which I should point out, we would be in, because of our water policies, in much the same situation that China is if our population was 40 times higher, which China's is. So the first step for Canada in this is don't make the mistakes that the Chinese are making. And that was the essential argument in my book.
Very interesting. So if there is one key message that you would like our viewers to take away, what would it be?
If I were to leave you with one message, it might be this. The foundation of my work with the UN and with other agencies is science. And it seems to me that the commandments of science can be reduced to two. Tell the truth and stand up for all humanity and for the planet, now and generations into the future. Good science involves not just the sharing of knowledge about the world. It is a candle we light when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. And I wish to offer you that there's probably never been a time in history when it's been more important to understand what science is telling us about the dangerous disconnect between our current societal direction and a sustainable future. We cannot let that candle go out.
Beautifully spoken, and some brilliant answers. It's been great speaking with you and getting your insights into some of these issues.
Great pleasure, Camille. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much for your time.